The explosions shook the ground so hard that Jake Martinez felt his teeth rattle in his skull. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling of the old mining tunnel where he had taken cover. His radio crackled with static and broken voices calling for backup that would never come. The 42nd Infantry Division was scattered across the surface of Kepler-7. Like leaves in a storm. Jake pressed his back against the cold metal wall and tried to catch his breath. His medic bag felt heavy on his shoulder, filled with supplies he had been using all morning to patch up wounded soldiers. The battle had started before dawn, and now the twin suns of Kepler-7 were high in the sky, turning the planet's red dirt into an oven. He had been trying to reach the evacuation point when a Zephyrian plasma blast had collapsed the tunnel behind him. Now he was trapped in the old research facility that the mining company had abandoned years ago. The sound of energy weapons echoed through the empty corridors, getting closer with each passing minute. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead and checked his rifle. Half a magazine left. Not much, but it would have to do. He had been a medic for 3 years, but before that he had been a regular soldier. He knew how to fight when he had to. A soft sound made him freeze. It was not the heavy footsteps of soldiers, or the whine of alien weapons. It was something else, something that sounded almost like crying. Jake moved carefully down the corridor, his boots making no sound on the dusty floor. The crying got louder as he got closer to what looked like an old laboratory. The door was half open and pale blue. Light spilled out into the hallway. He raised his rifle and peered around the edge of the door. What he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. A Zephyrian was sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, pressed against the wall like a trapped animal. But this was not a soldier. It was young, maybe 16 years old by human standards. The alien had the typical pale blue skin and large violet eyes of her species, but she was small and thin. Her clothes were torn and stained with blue blood. Zephyrian girl saw him, and her eyes went wide with terror. She tried to crawl backward, but there was nowhere to go. Her left arm was badly hurt, with a deep cut that went from her elbow to her wrist. Blue blood was pooling on the floor beneath her. Jake lowered his rifle slowly. The girl flinched and covered her face with her good arm, as if she expected him to shoot her right there. Her whole body was shaking with fear. "Hey," Jake said softly, the way he would talk to a scared child. "Hey, it's okay." The girl did not understand his words, but she heard the tone of his voice. She lowered her arm a little and looked at him. Her violet eyes were full of tears and pain. Jake could see that. She was losing a lot of blood. If he did not do something soon, she would die right there on the laboratory floor. He had taken an oath as a medic to help anyone who needed it, human or alien. But more than that, looking at this scared young girl, he could not just walk away. Set his rifle down on a table across the room and held up his hands so she could see they were empty. The girl watched him with wide eyes as he slowly reached for his medic bag. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, even though he knew she could not understand. "I just want to help." Jake pulled out his medical supplies and set them on the floor. Between them, bandages, antiseptic, painkillers, and surgical thread. The same things he used to treat human soldiers every day. The Zephyrian girl looked at the medical supplies and then back at his face. She seemed confused, as if she could not believe what she was seeing. Jake guessed that she had been told terrible things about humans, just like human soldiers were told that all aliens were monsters. He took out a clean cloth and soaked it with antiseptic. The girl's eyes followed his every movement as he crawled closer to her on his hands and knees, moving as slowly as possible so he would not scare her more. When he was close enough to touch her, Jake stopped and pointed to her wounded arm. Then he held up the cloth and made a gentle cleaning motion in the air. The girl looked at her arm and then at him. After a long moment, she nodded. Jake carefully took her arm in his hands. Her skin was cool to the touch and had a strange texture, almost like soft leather. The wound was worse than he had thought. It would need stitches to heal properly. As he cleaned the blood away, the girl made small sounds of pain, but she did not try to pull away. She watched his face the whole time, as if she was trying to figure out why this human soldier was being kind to her instead of killing her. The antiseptic made her wound bubble and foam as it killed the bacteria. Jake worked quickly but gently, the same way he had been trained to treat human patients. When the wound was clean, he took out his surgical needle and thread. The girl saw the needle and tensed up. Jake showed her what he was going to do by pretending to sew up a cut on his own arm. She understood and took a deep breath, preparing herself for the pain. Jake worked as fast as he could, making small, neat stitches to close the wound. The girl bit her lip to keep from crying out, but tears ran down her blue cheeks. When he was finished, he wrapped her arm in clean white bandages. The girl looked at her bandaged arm and then at Jake. For the first time since he had found her, she was not afraid. She was amazed. This human soldier, this enemy who was supposed to kill her, had saved her life instead. Jake packed up his medical supplies and sat back on his heels. The girl was still staring at him with those big violet eyes. She said something in her own language, words that sounded like music. Jake did not understand what she said, but he could hear the gratitude in her voice. Outside, the battle was still raging, but inside the old laboratory, something had changed. A human and an alien had met as enemies, but they were no longer fighting. They were just two people, and one had helped the other when she needed it most. The sound of marching boots echoed through the corridors outside the laboratory. Jake held up his hand in a gesture that needed no translation, and the Zephyrian girl went completely still. They both listened as the footsteps got closer, then passed by their hiding place and faded into the distance. Jake let out a breath he had been holding. Human patrol or alien, it did not matter. Either side would see them together and assume the worst. He looked at the girl, who was still pressed against the wall with her newly bandaged arm held close to her chest. She was looking at him with curiosity, now instead of fear. Her violet eyes moved from his face to his uniform, to the medical supplies scattered on the floor between them. Jake could almost see her mind working, trying to understand why he had helped her. The girl said something in her musical language and pointed to herself. Then she repeated the sound more slowly. Jake realized she was telling him her name. Lyra, he said, trying to copy the way she had said it. Her eyes lit up and she smiled for the first time. It was a beautiful smile that made her whole face change. She pointed at him and tilted her head in a question. Jake, he said, pointing to himself. Jake Martinez. Jake, she repeated, and the way she said his name sounded like a song. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of battle. Jake pulled out his water bottle and took a small sip. He noticed Lyra watching the bottle with thirsty eyes. Without thinking about it, he offered it to her. Lyra stared at the bottle as if it was the most precious thing in the world. She took it with her good hand and drank carefully, just a few small sips. Then she tried to give it back to him. Jake shook his head and pushed the bottle back toward her. She needed the water more than he did. Her blue skin was pale, and he could tell she was still weak from losing blood. While Lyra drank, Jake looked around the laboratory more carefully. The walls were covered with charts and pictures of plants and animals. There were microscopes on the tables and glass containers full of strange specimens. This was not a military facility. It was a place where scientists worked. Jake pointed to the charts on the wall and then to Lyra. She understood his question and nodded. She had been working here when the battle started. Lyra struggled to her feet, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. She walked over to one of the tables and picked up a thick notebook. The pages were covered with drawings and writing. In the flowing Zephyrian script dot, she brought the notebook back and sat down next to Jake, closer than she had been before. She opened it to a page covered with detailed drawings of local plants. Even though Jake could not read her language, he could see that the work was careful and scientific. Lyra pointed to one of the plant drawings and then made a gesture like she was crushing something in her hands. Then she pointed to her bandaged arm. Jake understood. She was showing him that some of the plants could be used as medicine. She flipped through more pages, showing him drawings of animals and insects, notes about soil samples and water quality. This was the work of someone who loved learning about the natural world. Jake thought about his own sister Katie, who was studying biology back on Earth. She would love to see work like this. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It showed him and Katie at her college graduation, both of them smiling at the camera. Katie looked tiny next to Jake in his dress uniform, but her smile was as bright as the sun. He showed the picture to Lyra. She looked at it carefully, and then pointed to Katie with a questioning look. "Sister," Jake said. "My sister Katie." Lyra smiled and nodded. She understood family, even if she could not understand his words. She said something in her own language that sounded warm and caring. Jake pulled out another photograph, this one, of his whole family at Christmas dinner. His parents, his grandparents, Katie, and himself, all gathered around a table full of food. Everyone was laughing at something his grandfather had said. Lyra studied the picture for a long time. She touched the faces of his family members gently with one finger, as if she was trying to memorize them. When she looked up at Jake, her eyes were sad. She said something in her language and shook her head. Jake realized she was telling him that her family was gone, probably killed in the war. He put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently, trying to tell her he understood her loss. They were interrupted by the sound of his stomach growling loudly. Jake felt his face get hot with embarrassment, but Lyra just laughed. It was a sound like silver bells, and it made Jake smile despite everything. Jake pulled out one of his emergency ration packs. It was not much, just some dried meat and crackers, but it would keep them both from getting too hungry. He tore the package open and divided the food into 2 equal piles. Lyra looked surprised when he pushed half the food toward her. She picked up one of the crackers and sniffed it carefully, before taking a tiny bite. Her face scrunched up at the taste, and she looked at Jake with an expression that clearly said the food was terrible. Jake laughed and nodded. Military rations were not known for their flavor. He took a bite of his own cracker and made a face, too, which made Lyra laugh again. As they ate their awful meal together, Jake found himself studying Lyra's face. She was beautiful in an alien way, with high cheekbones and large eyes that seemed to hold starlight. But more than that, she seemed kind and intelligent. She was nothing like the savage monsters that human propaganda described. Lyra was studying him, too. She pointed to the medical patch on his uniform and said something in her language. When Jake looked confused, she pretended to bandage an imaginary wound on her arm. "Medic," Jake said, pointing to himself. "I help hurt people." Lyra nodded and smiled. She understood that his job was to heal, not to hurt. She pointed to herself and then to her notebook, trying to explain what she did. "Scientist," Jake said, and Lyra repeated the word carefully. As the hours passed, they found more ways to communicate. Jake drew pictures in the dust on the floor to explain things. Lyra used her hands to act out ideas. They shared more food and water. They showed each other more pictures and drawings. Slowly, the fear between them disappeared completely. They were just 2 young people, trapped together by a war they had not started. finding friendship in the most unlikely place. When the sounds of battle grew quiet as night fell, Jake and Lyra huddled together for warmth in the cold laboratory. Lyra fell asleep with her head on Jake's shoulder, trusting him completely to keep her safe. Jake stayed awake, listening for danger. He looked down at the alien girl, sleeping peacefully beside him, and wondered how everything he had been taught about her people could be so wrong. Lyra was not a monster. She was just a person like him, trying to survive in a world gone mad with war. Outside, the battle would continue tomorrow. But inside their small refuge, a human and an alien had found something more powerful than hatred. They had found understanding. Jake woke up to the sound of voices speaking in the musical Zephyrian language. His heart jumped into his throat as he realized what was happening. A patrol of alien soldiers was searching the research facility, and they were getting closer, too. The laboratory. Lyra was already awake, her violet eyes wide with fear. She looked at Jake, and then toward the door, clearly torn between her loyalty to her own people and her new friendship with him. Jake could see the struggle on her face. The voices were just outside now. Jake grabbed his rifle and looked around for somewhere to hide, but the laboratory was too open. There was nowhere to go. In seconds, the Zephyrian soldiers would walk through that door and find them together. Lyra made her choice. She stood up quickly, ignoring the pain in her wounded arm, and pushed Jake toward a large equipment cabinet in the corner of the room. It was just big enough for him to squeeze inside if he crouched down. Jake hesitated, not wanting to leave her alone with soldiers who might hurt her. "Go," Lyra whispered in English, one of the few human words she had learned from him. Her voice was urgent but not afraid. She was trying to save him. Jake crawled into the cabinet just as the door to the laboratory opened. Through a crack in the cabinet door, he could see 3 Zephyrian soldiers enter the room. They were tall and imposing, in their dark armor, carrying weapons that hummed with deadly energy. The leader of the patrol saw Lyra and spoke to her in their language. His voice was harsh and commanding. Jake could not understand the words, but he could hear the suspicion in the soldier's tone. Lyra answered in a calm, steady voice. She gestured to her bandaged arm and then to the medical supplies that were still scattered on the floor. Jake held his breath as he watched her lie to protect him. One of the other soldiers picked up Jake's water bottle, which was still sitting where Lyra had left it. He showed it to the leader and said something that sounded like a question. Jake's heart pounded as he realized the bottle was clearly human, military issue. Lyra looked at the bottle without changing expression. She spoke again, her voice confident and sure. She pointed to the corridors beyond the laboratory and made a gesture that suggested soldiers had passed through, but were long gone. The leader studied Lyra's face for a long moment. Jake could see that the soldier was trying to decide whether to believe her story. If he searched the room thoroughly, he would find Jake in minutes, but Lyra's performance was perfect. She looked tired and hurt, exactly like someone who had been hiding alone in the abandoned facility. Her story made sense. Human soldiers could have passed through earlier, left supplies behind, and moved on without ever seeing her. The leader finally nodded and spoke to his men. They searched the room quickly, but not carefully, looking for obvious threats rather than hidden enemies. None of them thought to check inside the equipment cabinet. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the patrol left to continue their search elsewhere. Jake waited until their footsteps faded completely before crawling out of his hiding place. He looked at Lyra with amazement and gratitude. She had just risked her own life to save his. If the soldiers had discovered her lie, they would have considered her a traitor. The punishment for helping an enemy soldier would have been severe. "Thank you," Jake said, and Lyra understood even though the words were in English. She smiled and touched her bandaged arm. Her gesture said everything. He had saved her life first, so she had saved his in return. They were even now, but Jake knew it was more than that. Lyra could have turned him in and been rewarded as a hero by her own people. Instead, she had chosen to protect him because she no longer saw him as an enemy. She saw him as a friend. As the day went on, their friendship grew deeper. Jake taught Lyra some basic English words, and she taught him simple phrases in her language. They discovered that they both loved music, even though their music was very different. Lyra hummed songs from her world that sounded like flowing water, while Jake sang old Earth ballads that made her close her eyes and listen. Jake showed Lyra how to change the bandages on her wound properly. His hands were gentle as he unwrapped the old dressing and cleaned the healing cut. The stitches were holding well, and there was no sign of infection. In a few more days, she would be completely healed. Lyra watched him work and said something in her language that sounded like a compliment. When Jake looked confused, she mimed the action of a doctor examining a patient. She was telling him he was good at his job. "I wanted to be a teacher," Jake said, even though he knew she could not understand most of his words. "Before the war started, I was going to teach children. But then they needed medics, so I learned to fix people instead." Lyra seemed to understand that he was telling her something important about himself. She pointed to her notebook and then to him, asking a question with her eyes. Jake nodded. He would like to learn about her scientific work. Lyra opened the notebook to a page covered with detailed drawings of the planet's ecosystem. She began to explain her research, using simple words and gestures to help him understand. She showed him how the different plants and animals on Kepler-7 were connected to each other, how the small insects pollinated the flowers, which then fed the larger animals, which in turn fertilized the soil for new plants to grow. It was a beautiful, complex web of life that she had spent months studying. Jake was amazed by the depth of her knowledge. She was not just collecting specimens randomly. She was trying to understand how everything worked together as a whole system. It was the kind of work that could take years to complete. "Why?" Jake asked, pointing to the notebook and then to the planet around them. Lyra understood his question. She thought for a moment and then drew a simple picture in the dust. It showed 2 stick figures, one human and one Zephyrian, standing together next to a plant. She pointed to the plant and then to both figures. She was telling him that her research could help both their species. The medicines and foods they could develop from these plants would benefit everyone, not just the Zephyrians. She was working for peace, not war. Jake felt a deep respect for this young alien scientist who dreamed of a future where their peoples could work together instead of fighting. He pulled out a small notebook of his own, one where he kept medical notes about treating different kinds of injuries. He showed Lyra his drawings of human anatomy and his notes about which medicines worked best for different problems. She studied his work with the same interest he had shown in hers. As they shared their knowledge, Jake realized something incredible was happening. 2 people from different worlds, who had grown up thinking of each other as enemies, were finding out how much they had in common. They both wanted to heal instead of hurt. They both believed in learning and growing. They both cared about family and friendship. They both hoped for a future without war. When night fell again, they sat together in comfortable silence. Jake gave Lyra his jacket to keep her warm, and she shared some dried fruit she had found in her research supplies. It tasted strange but good, sweet and tangy at the same time. "Jake," Lyra said quietly, using one of the few names she could pronounce. Clearly, he looked at her and saw that she was trying to say something important. She pointed to him and then to herself, and then she made a gesture that showed 2 people walking together on the same path. Jake understood. She was telling him that they were friends now, real friends, despite everything that should have kept. them apart. He nodded and smiled, feeling the same way. Outside their refuge, the war between their peoples continued to rage. But inside the old laboratory, something new had been born. A friendship that crossed the lines of species and conflict, proving that understanding was possible even in the darkest times. The morning brought the distant sound of aircraft engines cutting through the thin air of Kepler 7. Jake woke up first and listened carefully to the noise. His heart jumped when he recognized the distinctive whine of human transport ships. Rescue had finally come. Lyra woke up a moment later, and she heard the sound too. Her violet eyes met Jake's, and they both understood what this meant. Their time together was ending. Jake stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over the research facility. In the distance, he could see 3 human dropships circling the area, searching for survivors. One of them was broadcasting the standard rescue signal on military frequencies. He could contact them right now. His radio had enough power left for 1 transmission. In 10 minutes, he could be on his way back to the safety of the human fleet. His wounds would be treated in a proper medical bay. He would be debriefed by intelligence officers, and then sent home to see his family. But what would happen to Lyra? Jake looked back at the alien girl who had become his friend. She was sitting quietly, watching him with those large, expressive eyes. She knew he had to go. She would not try to stop him or ask him to stay. That was not her way. If Jake called for rescue, the human soldiers would find Lyra within hours. They would capture her and take her to an interrogation facility. The intelligence officers would want to know everything about Zephyrian military positions, troop movements, and battle plans. Jake knew what happened to alien prisoners. He had seen the reports, even though they were classified. The interrogations were not gentle. Sometimes the prisoners did not survive them. The thought of Lyra being hurt made Jake's stomach twist with anger. She was not a soldier. She was a scientist, a healer in her own way, just like him. She had saved his life when she could have easily. Betrayed him to her own people. Jake walked over to where Lyra was sitting and knelt down beside her. He pulled out his notebook and drew a simple picture. It showed a human ship landing and soldiers getting out. Then he drew himself walking toward the ship. Lyra nodded. She understood that his people had come for him. Jake drew another picture. This one showed Lyra hiding while human soldiers searched the facility. Her face grew pale as she realized what he was telling her. If he left, she would be in terrible danger. But then Jake drew a third picture, and this one surprised her. It showed Lyra at a communication device, talking to Zephyrian ships in the sky. Lyra stared at the drawing with confusion. She pointed to herself, and then to the communication device, asking a question with her eyes. Jake nodded. He was going to help her call her own people for rescue. Lyra shook her head quickly and said something urgent in her language. She was trying to tell him that helping her would be treason. If his people found out, he would be court-martialed and probably executed. Jake understood her concern, but his mind was already made up. He had taken an oath as a medic to preserve life and do no harm. That oath did not say anything about only helping humans. It meant all life, including the life of this brave alien girl who had trusted him. He took Lyra's good hand in his and squeezed it gently. Then he stood up and walked over to the communication console that the research facility scientists had used to talk to their ships in orbit. The console was old, but it still had power. Jake had learned enough about alien technology during the war to figure out how to make it work. He activated the transmitter and handed the microphone to Lyra. Lyra stared at the microphone as if it might bite her. She looked at Jake and said something that sounded like she was asking if he was sure about this. Jake nodded firmly. He was sure. Lyra took a deep breath and began to speak into the microphone. Her voice was clear and strong as she called for help in her musical language. She gave her location and identification codes, requesting immediate extraction. Within minutes, a response came through the speaker. Jake could not understand the words, but he could hear the relief and urgency in the Zephyrian voice. They were sending ships to get her Dot as they waited for rescue to arrive. Jake and Lyra sat together one last time. Neither of them wanted to say goodbye, but they both knew it had to happen. Lyra reached into her pocket and pulled out a small crystal pendant. It was beautiful, with a blue-green color that seemed to glow with its own inner light. She pressed it into Jake's hand and said something in her language that sounded like a blessing. Jake realized this was something important from her culture, maybe something that had belonged to her family. He tried to give it back, but Lyra shook her head and closed his fingers around the crystal. Jake reached into his own pocket and pulled out his medical badge, the small metal pin that showed he was a qualified medic. It was not much to look at, just a simple red cross on a white background, but it represented everything he believed in. He pinned the badge to Lyra's shirt, right over her heart. She touched it gently and looked up at him with tears in her violet eyes. "First, do no harm," Jake said, pointing to the badge. He tried to explain with gestures that this was the promise all human doctors made, to help people instead of hurting them. Lyra repeated the English words carefully, even though she did not understand their full meaning. She could tell they were important to Jake, and that made them important to her too. The sound of approaching aircraft grew louder. Jake looked out the window and saw Zephyrian ships coming from the north, while human ships approached from the south. They had maybe 5 minutes before both rescue teams arrived. Jake took Lyra's notebook and wrote his name in English letters on the last page. Under his name, he drew a small picture of Earth, showing her where he came from. Then he handed the notebook back to her. Lyra wrote her own name in flowing Zephyrian script on the same page. Under it, she drew a picture of her home world, with its 3 moons and rings of ice crystals. They were exchanging addresses, promising to remember each other no matter how far apart they ended up. The Zephyrian ships landed first, just outside the research facility. Jake could see armed soldiers getting out and moving toward the building. In a few minutes, they would be here. Jake grabbed his rifle and medical bag. It was time to go. He looked at Lyra one last time, trying to memorize her face. He wanted to remember everything about this brave, kind girl who had changed the way he thought about the war. Lyra stood up and walked over to him. She was crying now, but she was also smiling. She said something in her language that sounded like a promise, and then she hugged him tightly with her good arm. Jake hugged her back, feeling his own eyes fill with tears. They were from different worlds, different species, but in that moment, they were just 2 friends who cared about each other. The sound of Zephyrian voices echoed through the corridors. Lyra's rescue team was here. Jake let go of her and ran toward the back exit of the laboratory. He had to get far enough away that the alien soldiers would not see him. When they found Lyra. As he reached the door, he turned back one last time. Lyra was standing in the middle of the room, holding his medical badge and watching him go. She raised her hand in a wave goodbye. Jake waved back and then ran out into the corridors of the research facility. Behind him, he could hear Lyra calling out to her rescuers in her musical language. She was safe now. Jake activated his radio and called for human pickup at his new location. Within minutes, a dropship was landing to take him home. As the human ship lifted off into the sky, Jake looked down and saw the Zephyrian ships taking off from the research facility. Somewhere in one of those alien vessels was his friend Lyra. Heading back to her own people. Jake touched the crystal pendant she had given him and made a silent promise. Someday, when this war was over, he would find her again. They would work together to build the peace that both of them dreamed of. The alien girl who had thought he came to kill her had become the most important person in his life. She had taught him that enemies could become friends, and that understanding was always possible for those brave enough to try. 6 months had passed since Jake Martinez had said goodbye to Lyra in the abandoned research facility on Kepler-7. The war between humans and Zephyrins continued to rage across a dozen worlds, but something had changed in the way Jake fought. Sergeant Jake Martinez, newly promoted after his heroic survival on Kepler-7, stood in the prisoner-holding area of the human military base on Arcturus Station. In front of him were 12 Zephyrian soldiers who had been captured during the battle for the outer colonies. The prisoners sat on simple metal benches, their hands bound with energy restraints. They looked tired and defeated, their blue skin pale with exhaustion. Most of them kept their large violet eyes fixed on the floor, afraid to look at their human captors. Jake walked slowly down the line of prisoners, studying each face. None of them was Lyra, but he saw something of her in each of them. They were not monsters or demons. They were just people who had been caught up in a war they probably never wanted to fight. Sergeant Martinez called Lieutenant Wilson from the door. Intelligence wants to start the interrogations. Should we separate them into individual cells? Jake looked at the frightened alien prisoners and thought about Lyra hiding in that laboratory, convinced that he was going to kill her. These soldiers expected the same treatment from him. No, Jake said firmly. We keep them together for now. And I want medical checkups for all of them before any questioning starts. Some of them look injured. Lieutenant Wilson frowned. Sir, the intelligence officers want to begin immediately while the prisoners are still disoriented. They say waiting gives them time to prepare their stories. The prisoners will be treated according to the rules of war, Jake said in a voice that brooked no argument. Medical care first, then proper interrogation procedures. No exceptions. Jake had been having this same argument with officers all over the human fleet for months. His experience with Lyra had changed the way he saw alien prisoners, and he was not afraid to speak up about it. He opened his medical bag and walked over to the first prisoner, a young Zephyrian who could not have been much older than Lyra. The alien flinched when Jake approached, clearly expecting to be hurt. It's okay, Jake said in the few words of Zephyrian he had learned. I am a healer. The young soldier's eyes went wide with surprise. He had not expected a human to speak his language, even a little bit. More importantly, he had not expected kindness. Jake examined the prisoner's injuries with gentle hands, cleaning cuts and bandaging wounds just as he would for human soldiers. Word of his unusual treatment of alien prisoners had spread through the fleet, earning him both praise and criticism from different officers. Some called him soft and said he was being manipulated by clever alien propaganda. But others, especially the younger soldiers, began to follow his example. They started to see their enemies as people instead of monsters. Jake had also been sending encrypted messages through covert channels, using communication networks that intelligence had not yet discovered. The messages were addressed to a Zephyrian scientist on Kepler-7.